Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Bet, Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnah should be Le'ilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. Rabotai, we're going to give a general introduction to the following Mishnah that we're going to learn. In order to determine the status of produce that was planted in the 6th year, but it didn't finish growing until the 7th year, we have to first determine whether the produce is considered a product of the 6th year and has no Shemitah sanctity, or if it's considered a product of the 7th year and it would have Shemitah sanctity. That's number one. Another practical outcome to determining on which year we consider it produce of, it's regarding Tumot HaMasod, the separation, the tithes. We know that out of a 7-year Shemitah cycle, during the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th year, you have to separate Maaser Sheni and eat it in Yerushalayim. On the 3rd and 6th year of the Shemitah cycle, you have to separate Maaser Ani and give it to the poor. Now, in order to know which Maaser to separate from produce that was planted in 1 year but didn't finish growing until the next year, you have to determine whether the produce is considered the product of the earlier year or the later year. Now, the year in which the produce has grown is really determined on when the produce reaches a certain stage of growth. That stage of growth differs for different types of species. The status of grain like wheat and barley depends on wheat when it reaches a third of its growth. The status of fruits depends on when it first emerges from the tree, and the status of vegetables depends on when they are picked. The Mishnah now is going to discuss certain exceptions to these rules. Ha'orez v'atochan v'pragin v'shimshimin. Rice, millet, poppy, and sesame plants sheishrishu lifnei Rosh Hashanah, that they took root before Rosh Hashanah, mitasrin l'sha'avar, they're tithed as produce of the previous year, meaning even though the produce didn't actually grow until the following year, we're going to consider when it took root. For example, let's say they were planted during the 3rd year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, and they took root before Rosh Hashanah. They are considered 3rd year produce, which you have to separate Maaser Ani from, even if they grew and they were picked during the 4th year. Mutarin b'Shviit. Likewise, if they were planted during the 6th year and they took root before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, they are permitted on Shemitah, meaning they have no Shemitah sanctity, even if they grew and were picked during Shemitah. And the Mefarshim tell us, even if they took root during the 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, when the field can no longer be worked, like we spoke about yesterday. But if they did not take root until after Rosh Hashanah, Asurin b'Shviit, they are forbidden on Shemitah, meaning they have Shemitah sanctity. Umitasrin l'shana haba. Likewise, regarding when we determine its year for Ma'asrot, they are tithed as produce of the following year. For example, if they were planted in the 3rd year, but they didn't take root until after Rosh Hashanah of the 4th year, they are considered produce of the 4th year, and you would have to give Maaser Sheni and bring it to Yerushalayim and eat it there. Now, according to our Tana, rice, millet, poppy, and sesame are the only species whose status depends on when they took root. Other species, we said in general, vegetables, it's when you pick it, etc. We give the different rules. Now, the reason these specific species are different from the others is because their plants don't all grow at the same time. For example, let's say in a rice field, right? Some plants are going to grow more quickly than others, even if the entire field was planted at once. So if we would determine their status by when they reach a third of its growth or when they were picked, the crop that's harvested basically will contain a mixture of produce for different years. That's going to be a problem. Why? Because each year's produce has to be tied separately. Therefore, the Chachamim decided that the status of these species are going to be determined on when they take root, because since they were all, these plants were all, let's say, since the plants that are planted at the same time will take root at the same time, the entire crop is going to be considered from 1 year out of the Shemitah cycle. Now, even though the Chachamim are causing a person, they're exempting produce from certain masot in which they would have been obligated technically. If we would have went by when it was picked or growth, they technically would have been obligated to masot of different years. The Chachamim have the right to do this because masot of fruits, legumes, and vegetables only drabanan. Likewise, when the Mishnah is talking about Shemitah, it's speaking about Shemitah in our times, which is only drabanan. That is Rabotai Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet is going to discuss again a number of other species that is determined based on the year when they took root. Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says, plants of Egyptian beans that were planted from the start to use their beans as seeds, instead of eating, he used it for the seeds to plant. They have the same law as those species that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, meaning if they take root before Rosh Hashanah, they have the status of produce of the previous year, and if they take root after Rosh Hashanah, they have the status of the produce of the following year. And again, what the Mefarshim explained to us that when you plant Egyptian beans for their seed, again, they're not all picked at one time. Therefore, they're in the same category as the produce that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. However, if when he planted them, he planned on eating them, even if later on he changed his mind and decided to use them for their seed, they are like any other vegetable, and its status depends on when they were picked. So if they were picked after Rosh Hashanah, they would have the status of produce for the following year, no matter when they took root. The Tana of the previous Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Shimon ben Shizuri, because if you notice, he didn't say Egyptian beans. He said rice, millet, poppy, and sesame plants. Now, the reason he disagrees with Rabbi Shimon ben Shizuri and is because he holds that Egyptian beans are generally planted for eating. Because of that, we don't take into account the intention of a person who's planting it for their seeds. Therefore, the Egyptian beans, according to the previous Tana, always have the same law as regular vegetables, and we go by when they were picked. Rabbi Shimon says, Afunin, Hagamlonin, Kayotze Bahen, large beans, and the Mefarshim tell us, we don't exactly know what it's referring to, the Mishnah, but it's referring to a specific species of large beans. Hafunin, Hagamlonin, Kayotze Bahen, these large beans have the same law as Egyptian beans, meaning when he planted them, if he planted it to use as seed, the status is based on when they took root. Rabbi Elazar says, Afunin hagamlonin mishetirmelu lifnei Rosh Hashanah. The law of large beans is they are considered produce of the previous year when the plants formed pods before Rosh Hashanah, even if they were picked after Rosh Hashanah. Meaning, if they did not form pods until after Rosh Hashanah, even if they took root before Rosh Hashanah, they have the status of the following year when they were picked. So in essence, Rabbi Elazar is going by when the pods were formed, but the Mefarshim do point out to us that even this is only true if he planted it to use as seed. But if he planted them to eat them, they're again considered like any other vegetable, and the status depends on when they are picked. But when you plant them for their seeds, in order to plant again, we go by when they form pods. So again, if they form pods before Rosh Hashanah, even if you picked it after Rosh Hashanah, it has a status of the previous year. But if they did not form pods until after, even if they took root before Rosh Hashanah, they have the status of the following year when they were picked. That is in Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.